Hey guys, welcome back to Planet Mithra, and today we are taking a trip into the Kingdom of Khazad Dum with our very first dwarf model that isn't Gimli on the channel. We are painting the stalwart bodyguards of Durin and their kinsmen, the Khazad Guard. This model gives us a really good chance to play around with some golds, silvers, and some really bright and vibrant colours that best befit their dwarfish kin, so we're really excited to get this on the channel today. As always, we cleaned and prepped our model by getting rid of all the mould lines on the model as well as trimming off any flash, as the Khazad Guard sculpts are all metal, so there might be some flash on the model, but make sure you get rid of as much of this as you can without damaging the sculpt. The model was then affixed to the base using super glue, and the base was finally covered with fine modelling sand, and once this was dry, we undercoated our model with Citadel Chaos Black Spray. We hope you enjoy our first delving into the Kingdom of the Dwarves today with our first model. We have more dwarves coming up very soon in the future, but until then, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. First, we're going to start off using Citadel Runelord Brass and apply this as a base coat to all the gold and brassy armour. We want to apply this in a couple of thinner coats to get a nice smooth finish and avoid any unpatchy blemishing as the paint goes over, as the metallic paints can be quite temperamental at times. Now we're going to use Leadbelcher, and we're going to very carefully just pick out the axe blades on both the double-handed axe in his hand and the single-handed axe on his back, as well as applying a thorough dry brush of Leadbelcher to all the chainmail. Now we can use Caliban Green and apply this as a base coat to all the cloth hanging down underneath the chainmail and along the elbow grooves between the chainmail and the gloves. We're going to start by giving all the gold armour a wash with some thinned down Druchii Violet. This purple shade will complement the look of the Runelord Brass really well once dry and just give some nice little subtle undertones to the main body of the armour. Be careful to avoid it pooling too much to not get any massive purple areas once it's dried. Now we're going to tone down the armour overall by applying a thin down wash of Agrak Surshade, letting this form in all the recesses between all the armour plating and along all the rivets and joins in all the plating itself. Once both washes are dry, we're going to apply a layer now with a mix of Runelord Brass and Liberator Gold. The Liberator Gold will bring up the tone of the Runelord Brass really nicely, but also not too garish as to make it look too much of a contrast between the darker, washed areas and this now slightly brighter layering stage. We want to try and leave the wash showing as much as we can between all the grooves in all the armour plating and any recesses around the facial area. This will create a nice transition from the darker areas of armour to the lighter, more reflective surfaces. Now we're going to apply an interim glaze with some thoroughly thinned down Seraphim Sepia, and apply this as we did with the other washes all over the gold armour. This will just lift the tone a little bit more and make it a little bit more goldy and vibrant than it would be otherwise. Now we're going to use Canoptech Alloy and apply this as a fine edge highlight around all the edges of the armour plating, being careful not to bleed too much onto our previous layering and shading stages. Keeping our highlights nice and tight, nice and thin, so we can really get some nice precise edges on all this armour plating and all the edges of the gold detailing around the back and the front of the armour plating. Finally, we're going to use Rune Fang Steel and just apply a pinpoint dot highlight to the uppermost points of all the armour plating and the most pronounced areas, just where the light will be bouncing off the more reflective surfaces more prominently. Now we're going to apply a wash with thinned down non-oil all over the chainmail and all over the axe blades. Be careful not to let the wash pool in any holes in the axe head, because we don't want this to form any unsightly blemishes once this is dry. Now we're going to layer over with lead belcher, focusing this layer stage towards the upper areas of chainmail and towards the outer areas of all the axe blades. Finally, using Ironbreaker, we're going to apply a fine edge highlight just to the sharpest areas and the absolute outer edges of all the blade work on the axes, as well as picking out the most raised areas of all the chainmail, just to create a nice sense of flow and definition across all the ringed material. We're going to layer over all the cloth now with a mix of Caliban Green and Warpstone Glow. We can leave the Caliban Green showing in the absolute deepest recesses and the most recessed areas of all the most pronounced folds in material. Now we're going to apply a slightly thinned down wash with BL Tan Green just all over these green cloth areas. Once the wash is dry, we're going to increase the amount of Warpstone Glow in the previous mix and apply this as a layer all over the cloth areas, leaving the wash and the Caliban Green showing in the recesses. Once you're happy with how this looks, we're going to apply another layer now with pure Warpstone Glow, keeping the application of this paint tighter and thinner than it was previously to create a natural definition and flow between the darker areas and lighter areas of all the cloth, starting to focus more on the upper areas and most pronounced folds in material. For the next few highlight stages, we started to add Zemesi Desert into the Warpstone mix and continued to add Zemesi Desert for each subsequent highlight stage. This started as about a 1 part Zemesi Desert, 3 parts Warpstone Glow mix, working up our way through a 50-50 blend all the way to a 75-25% blend of Zemesi Desert to Warpstone for the final edge highlight. At each application, keep your highlights tighter and thinner than the previous application to further progress the transition of darkness through light in the material. We're going to use Storm Vermin Fur now, and we're going to very carefully pick out all the big bushy beard down the front of his chest, as well as all the hair down the back of his head. Again, apply this in a couple of thin down coats to get nice smooth coverage, and make sure you get all the underside of the beard and between every single strand. Now we're going to apply a light wash with non-oil just to tone back the beard and give it a little bit more of a natural look to the base colour. This will also help create some initial definition between the hairs. Once the wash is dry, we can start painstakingly further pushing the definition in all the hair. We're going to start by relayering over with Storm Vermin Fur, taking particular care and attention to pick out all the individual hairs across the beard and the hair, to pave our way for our layering and highlighting stages later. This can take time, so make sure you've got a good point to your brush and be as precise as possible here. Now we're going to start layering up with a mix of storm vermin fur and Ulthran grey, and as we did with the previous stage, focusing on each individual strand of hair, create nice long unbroken lines to create a nice sense of flowy billowy beard and hair. Keep your highlights slightly tighter and slightly thinner than the previous stage, again just to further push the definition of shading through to the lighter areas of hair. You can increase the amount of Ulthran grey in the mix as many times as you like for each subsequent layering stage. At each point, try and keep your highlights tighter and thinner, just to further push the authentic look to the hair and beard we're going for. Now we're going to use pure Ulthran grey and just apply some final definition to all the hair on the model. We're going to apply this just to the tips of all the beard and the hair on the back of the head, as well as the most pronounced and outer curls, just to create a nice sense of movement across all the beard and the hair. Now we're going to use Rhinox hide, and being very careful not to bleed out onto any of the finished areas, base coat the gloves, the boots, the inner working of the helmet, and the satchel down the side of his waist. At this stage as well, we're also going to apply a base coat to the belt that goes around this midsection with dryad bark. Now we're going to apply a wash to all the brown and leather areas with Agrak Surshade. Now we're going to use a mix of Rhinox hide and Scrag brown and layer up the gloves, boots, inner helmet area and satchel respectively. We can start creating some definition within the finger joins whilst leaving the wash showing in some of the deepest recesses and folds in all the material. Now we're going to start adding Baneblade Brown and push these highlights a little bit further and creating a little bit of definition by framing the outer workings and the most upper and outer folds of all this brown material. Creating more definition down the fingers, separating those out a bit more, framing the boots. They've got quite blocky, rigid frames, so we can frame those quite nicely and quite easily by focusing towards the edges of all the framework on the boots. And with the helmet interior, very carefully drawing 3 small concentric lines that go around horizontally the inner workings of the helmet for a little bit of freehand detail, because that never hurts. Now we're going to increase the amount of Baneblade Brown in the mix and just create some more definition by pushing these highlights a little bit neater, a little bit tighter, all over the previous layer. Finally, we're going to use pure Baneblade Brown now and just apply a very, very extreme edge highlight to the absolute most edges and upper areas of all the leather and brown material on the model. This includes just picking out the knuckle joins in the fingers and thumbs, holding the axe nice and tightly, the most upper areas of folds and the very edges of the blocky framework on the boots, and very carefully highlighting the freehand pattern on the inner working of the helm with some really nice, thin, precise lines. Now we're going to highlight the belt with a mix of dryad bark and Gawthor brown just on the upper and lower areas of the belt itself. Now we're going to use pure Gawthor brown and just apply a final highlight to the belt itself just to make it pop that little bit more against all the gold and silver. Now we're going to use Doomball brown mixed with a little bit of dryad bark and base coat all the shafts for all the axes on the model, making sure we get all around the circumference of the axe shaft to get nice, smooth and uniform coverage throughout. And we're going to add a little bit of Tuscarora fur to the mix and just apply this as a layer over the sides of the axe shaft facing the light and that are most prominent to the light source. Now we're going to use pure Tuscarora fur now and just apply a highlight down all the edges of all the axe shafts. Nice and neat, nice and precise, and as carefully as you can. Finally, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Tuscarora fur and pallid witch flesh and just apply a very light highlight to the upper edges of all the axe shafts. The model's base was painted in a 3-stage dry brush using dryad bark for our initial undercoat, followed up with Baneblade brown instead of our usual Gawthor brown to give a slightly different feel to the base, and finally followed up with pallid witch flesh, very lightly over the top. We then decorated the base with some Midland tufts and clump foliage. This would best represent the wandering dwarf that we want to go for. You can otherwise decorate your base with some rubble and rocks to best befit the Kingdom of Khazad Dum. Finally, we painted the rim of the base with dryad bark. And there we have it, our Khazad Guard ready to stand in defence of Durin and his kinsfolk in Khazad Dum against the horrible and evil dwellers of Moria.